Jack Miller, a racist cop, slaps a black woman without hesitation. But when her son arrives moments later, Jack's arrogance crumbles, and he desperately begs for mercy. What happens next will shatter Jack's world and change his life forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Lillian Robinson stepped out of the community center, her heart full of warmth from another day spent helping others. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the quiet streets of her neighborhood. She took a deep breath, savoring the peaceful moment. At 52, Lillian carried herself with a gentle grace that seemed to put everyone around her at ease. Her kind, brown eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled, thinking about the families she'd helped today. Organizing events for those less fortunate was more than just volunteer work for Lillian. It was her calling. As she walked home, her thoughts drifted to her son, Logan. A surge of pride swelled in her chest. Logan had become a well-known civil rights attorney, fighting for justice in ways Lillian could only dream of. She loved him fiercely, but the attention his work brought made her uncomfortable at times. "I prefer my quiet life," Lillian murmured to herself, adjusting the strap of her worn canvas bag on her shoulder. The familiar houses of her neighborhood lined the street, their lawns neatly trimmed and flowers blooming in carefully tended gardens. Lillian waved to Mrs. Johnson, who was watering her roses. "Evening, Lillian," Mrs. Dela Cruz called out. "How was the center today?" "Wonderful as always," Lillian replied with a warm smile. "We're planning a big summer picnic for the families next month." As she continued down the sidewalk, Lillian noticed a couple walking on the other side of the street. The woman clutched her purse a little tighter as they passed, eyeing Lillian warily. Lillian's smile faltered for a moment, but she pushed the hurt aside. It wasn't the first time she'd experienced such reactions, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. A few houses down, Mr. Peterson was mowing his lawn. He'd lived next door to Lillian for years, yet he always seemed surprised to see her in the neighborhood. "Oh, hello there," he said, his tone a mix of politeness and uncertainty. "Are you, visiting someone around here?" Lillian felt a familiar pang in her chest but kept her voice steady and kind. "No, Mr. Peterson. I live just down the street, remember? Been here for 20 years now." "Oh, right, of course," he mumbled, looking embarrassed. "Have a good evening, then." As Lillian continued her walk home, she couldn't help but feel the weight of these small, daily reminders of how others sometimes saw her. But she held her head high, focusing instead on the good she'd done that day and the love she felt for her community. Lillian stepped into her favorite cafe, the warm aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries enveloping her. The cozy space buzzed with the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of cups. As she entered, familiar faces turned to greet her with genuine smiles. "Hey there, Miss Lillian," called out Tom, a regular who always sat by the window. "How's that community center of yours doing?" Lillian's eyes crinkled with warmth as she replied, "It's thriving, Tom. Thanks for asking." She made her way to the counter where Sarah, the young barista, was already reaching for Lillian's usual mug. "The usual today, Miss Robinson?" Sarah asked, her freckled face beaming. "You know me too well, dear," Lillian chuckled softly. As Sarah prepared her coffee, Lillian chatted with her about the upcoming summer classes at the community center. The girl's eyes lit up when Lillian mentioned the free art workshops. "That sounds amazing. I bet the kids will love it," Sarah exclaimed, carefully handing over the steaming mug. Lillian took a sip, savoring the rich flavor. "I hope so. It's all about giving them a chance to express themselves." With a final warm smile and wave to the cafe's patrons, Lillian turned to leave. Just as she reached for the door, it burst open suddenly. Officer Jack Miller rushed in, his face flushed and brow furrowed. Lillian stumbled back, nearly spilling her coffee. "Oh my!" Jack barely glanced at her, his eyes darting around the cafe impatiently. His uniform was slightly disheveled, and there was a tightness to his jaw that spoke of barely contained frustration. "Sorry," he muttered, not meeting Lillian's eyes as he brushed past her. Lillian could feel the tension radiating off him. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should say something kind to the clearly agitated officer. But before she could decide, Jack had already pushed his way to the counter, barking out an order for a quick lunch. With a small sigh, Lillian stepped out onto the sidewalk, the warmth of the cafe giving way to the cooler outdoor air. She couldn't help but wonder what had Officer Miller in such a state. It was clear he was having a rough day, and Lillian felt a twinge of sympathy despite his brusque behavior. As Lillian stepped out onto the sidewalk, she took a moment to breathe in the fresh air. The warmth of her coffee cup seeped into her hands, a comforting sensation against the cool breeze. She was about to take another sip when the cafe door suddenly burst open behind her. Officer Jack Miller stormed out, his face a storm cloud of frustration. He wasn't looking where he was going, his mind clearly elsewhere. Before Lillian could react, Jack collided with her forcefully. Time seemed to slow as the coffee cup tilted, its contents spilling in a hot cascade over Jack's uniform. The dark liquid spread quickly across his chest, staining the crisp blue fabric. "Oh no!" Lillian gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. "I'm so sorry, officer." But Jack wasn't listening, his face contorted with fury as he looked down at his ruined uniform. When his eyes snapped up to meet Lillian's, they were blazing with anger. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, his voice booming in the quiet street. "Can't you watch where you're going?" Lillian took a step back, her heart racing. I'm truly sorry," she stammered. "It was an accident. Let me help you clean up." "An accident?" Jack's voice dripped with sarcasm. "More like carelessness. Do you have any idea how this looks? How am I supposed to do my job looking like this?" People on the street were starting to stare. Some stopped in their tracks, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Lillian could feel their gazes on her, making her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Officer, please," she said softly, trying to calm the situation. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I can pay for the dry cleaning." But Jack was beyond reason. His face was red, a vein pulsing in his forehead. "Disrespect? That's exactly what this is. You people never have any respect for authority." Before Lillian could process what was happening, Jack's hand shot out. There was a sharp crack as his palm connected with her cheek. The force of the slap sent Lillian stumbling backward, her hand flying to her face in shock. A collective gasp rose from the growing crowd. Lillian stood frozen, her cheek stinging, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. She could feel tears welling up in her eyes, not just from the pain but from the humiliation and injustice of it all. Jack stood there, his chest heaving, seeming to realize what he'd done. But instead of apologizing, his face hardened. He glared at Lillian and the stunned onlookers, daring anyone to challenge him. The street had gone eerily quiet. Lillian could hear her own ragged breathing, feel her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around at the shocked faces of the witnesses, some with phones out, others with hands over their mouths in disbelief. In that moment, standing there with her cheek burning and her dignity in tatters, Lillian felt more alone than she ever had before. As Lillian stood there, her cheeks stinging and her eyes brimming with tears, a tall figure emerged from the crowd. Logan Robinson strode forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. He had witnessed the entire incident from across the street, and now his purposeful steps carried him swiftly to his mother's side. "Mom," Logan said softly, gently placing a hand on Lillian's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Lillian looked up at her son, relief washing over her features. "Logan," she whispered, her voice trembling. Logan's eyes, filled with concern for his mother, hardened as they shifted to Jack. The police officer's anger seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by a look of dawning horror as he recognized the man before him. You're Logan Robinson," Jack stammered, his face paling. The once imposing officer now looked small and afraid. Logan's voice was low and steady, but it carried an unmistakable edge. "That's right, Officer Miller. And you've just assaulted my mother in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses." Jack's eyes darted around frantically, taking in the crowd of onlookers, many with their phones out recording the scene. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Mr. Robinson, please. This is all just a big misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Logan's eyebrow arched. I saw you strike my mother. There's no misunderstanding about that. Jack's composure crumbled entirely. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It was an accident. Please, you have to believe me. Logan stood tall, his presence commanding. The crowd watched in hushed anticipation as he spoke. Officer Miller, your actions today were not just a violation of your oath to protect and serve. They were a criminal act. Lillian, still shaken but finding her voice, gently touched her son's arm. Logan, maybe we should... Logan's eyes narrowed as he faced Jack, his voice cold and precise. Officer Miller, what you've done here today isn't just a personal attack on my mother. It's a gross abuse of the power entrusted to you as a police officer. Jack's face crumpled, his earlier bravado completely gone. Mr. Robinson, please. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't cut it, Logan replied, his words sharp as steel. You swore an oath to protect and serve. Instead, you've assaulted an innocent woman in broad daylight. This isn't just about my mother. It's about every citizen who deserves to feel safe around those meant to protect them. The crowd around them murmured, some nodding in agreement. Jack's eyes darted nervously from face to face, realizing the gravity of his situation. Your apologies mean nothing, Logan continued. Actions have consequences, Officer Miller, and yours will be addressed in a court of law. I'll make sure of that. Jack's shoulders slumped, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, Mr. Robinson. I have a family. This job is all I have. Logan remained unmoved. You should have thought about that before you raised your hand to strike my mother. As Logan spoke, Lillian gently tugged at his sleeve. Her voice was soft but steady. Logan, honey, maybe there's a better way to handle this? Logan turned to his mother, his expression softening slightly. Mom, what he did was wrong. He needs to be held accountable. Lillian nodded, her eyes showing a mix of concern and trust. I know, sweetie, and I trust your judgment. I'm just worried about all the attention this might bring. Logan took his mother's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I understand, Mom, but sometimes standing up for what's right means facing the spotlight. We can't let this slide. Lillian sighed, then nodded again. You're right, of course. I never wanted to be at the center of something like this. I know, Mom, Logan said gently, but sometimes change starts with one person standing up, and today, that person is you. Logan gently guided his mother home, his arm protectively around her shoulders. As they walked, Lillian leaned into her son's strength, her mind still reeling from the incident at the cafe. The familiar sight of their modest home brought a small measure of comfort as they approached the front door. Once inside, Lillian sank into her favorite armchair, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her skirt. Logan knelt beside her, his face etched with concern. Mom, are you okay? He asked softly. Lillian managed a weak smile. I'm fine, honey. Just a little shaken up. Logan squeezed her hand. I promise I'll handle everything. You don't need to worry about a thing. Lillian's brow furrowed and she bit her lip. Logan, I'm not sure about this lawsuit. Do we really need to go through with it? Logan's expression grew serious. Mom, what Officer Miller did was wrong. We can't let him get away with it. I know, but... Lillian hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. All this attention, the media, I'm not sure I can handle it. Logan sat on the arm of the chair, wrapping an arm around his mother. I understand it's scary, Mom. But standing up to abuse isn't just about us. It's about all the people who've suffered at the hands of men like Jack Miller. Lillian nodded slowly, considering her son's words. You really think this could help others? I do, Logan said firmly. Your courage could inspire others to speak out. We have a chance to make real change here. As Lillian pondered this, miles away at the police station, Jack Miller slumped into his desk chair, his face ashen. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force. His hands shook as he loosened his tie, replaying the scene at the cafe over and over in his mind. What have I done? He whispered to himself, the enormity of his mistake finally sinking in. Jack's eyes darted nervously around the station, wondering if his colleagues could sense the fear radiating off him. The thought of losing his job, his reputation, everything he'd worked for, made his stomach churn. As he sat there paralyzed by dread, Jack realized that his moment of uncontrolled anger might have just cost him everything. The future he'd taken for granted now hung by a thread, and he had no one to blame but himself. Logan sat at his desk, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he prepared the official lawsuit documents. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, but he felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about justice for everyone who had suffered similar abuses. With a deep breath, Logan hit submit on the electronic filing system. The lawsuit against Jack Miller and the police department was now official. He leaned back in his chair, knowing that the real work was just beginning. Within hours, news of the lawsuit spread like wildfire. Logan's phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters seeking comments. He declined most, but carefully chose a few respected journalists to give brief statements to. "This case is about holding those in power accountable," Logan told one reporter. "No one should be above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it." Meanwhile, across town, Jack Miller's world was crumbling. He sat in the break room, scrolling through his phone in horror. The video of him slapping Lillian had gone viral, shared thousands of times with angry comments flooding in. How could he do that to that poor woman? "This is why people don't trust cops. He should be fired immediately." Jack's hand shook as he put down his phone. He looked up to see two of his fellow officers enter the room, then quickly turn and leave when they spotted him. The cold shoulder from his colleagues stung, but Jack knew he deserved it. Just then his phone rang. It was Captain Harris. "Miller, my office now." The captain's voice was ice cold. Jack's stomach dropped as he made his way to the captain's office. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the station on him, judging him. As he approached the door, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Captain Harris sat behind his desk, his face a mask of anger and disappointment. "Sit down, Miller," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Jack sank into the seat, feeling smaller by the second. "Do you have any idea of the shitstorm you've created?" Captain Harris asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I've got the mayor breathing down my neck, the media camped outside, and a lawsuit that could cost this department millions." "Captain, Jack started, but Harris cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I don't want to hear your excuses," he snapped. "You've put this entire department at risk with your actions. What were you thinking, assaulting a civilian like that?" Jack hung his head, unable to meet his superior's gaze. The gravity of his actions was finally sinking in, and he realized there was no way to justify what he'd done. Captain Harris's stern voice filled the small office as he continued to berate Jack. "This isn't just about you anymore, Miller. Your actions have put the entire department under scrutiny." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushed with shame and anger. He tried to interject. "Captain, I know it looks bad, but—" "Looks bad?" Captain Harris cut him off, his eyes flashing with fury. "It doesn't just look bad, Miller. It is bad. We've got video evidence of you assaulting an innocent woman, and not just any woman, but the mother of one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the state." Jack's stomach churned as the reality of his situation sank in. He had really messed up this time, and there was no easy way out. Captain Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of disappointment and frustration. "I've got no choice here, Miller. You're suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the internal investigation and this lawsuit." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. "Suspended? But Captain, I need this job. I've got bills to pay, a family to support." "You should have thought about that before you decided to slap a civilian," Captain Harris replied coldly. "Turn in your badge and gun before you leave. And Jack, don't expect any favors from the department on this one. We can't afford to protect you this time." Jack's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge and placed it on the captain's desk. He felt naked without it, vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced before. As he left the station, Jack could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some looked away quickly, while others stared openly, their faces a mix of shock and disapproval. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, making each step feel like a mile. Outside, the bright sunlight seemed to mock Jack's dark mood. He stood on the sidewalk, feeling lost and cornered. His job, his reputation, everything he'd worked for was now hanging by a thread. And deep down, a small voice whispered that he had no one to blame but himself. As the days ticked by, Logan Robinson threw himself into preparing for the upcoming hearing. His office buzzed with activity, files piling up on every surface as his team worked tirelessly to build their case against Officer Jack Miller and the police department. One afternoon, Logan sat at his desk, rubbing his tired eyes. He'd been poring over witness statements for hours, trying to piece together the exact sequence of events outside the cafe. Something wasn't adding up, and it nagged at him. Just then, his assistant, Rita, burst into the office, her eyes wide with excitement. "Logan, you need to see this right away." Logan looked up, startled. "What is it, Sarah?" "We finally got the security camera footage from the cafe," she said, waving a USB drive. "It just came in." Logan's heart raced as he grabbed the drive. This could be the breakthrough they needed. He quickly inserted it into his computer and called his team into the office. As they huddled around the screen, Logan hit play. The grainy black and white footage showed the exterior of the cafe. They watched as Lillian exited, her movements calm and unhurried. Then, just as she stepped onto the sidewalk, a blur of motion caught their attention. Logan leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "Wait, is that—" The team fell silent as they watched Officer Jack Miller rush into frame. He was moving so fast, so frantically, that he didn't seem to notice Lillian at all. In a split second, Jack collided with Lillian, sending her coffee flying. Logan's jaw dropped. "He bumped into her," he whispered, hardly believing his eyes. "Jack caused the spill, not my mother." The team erupted into excited chatter, but Logan barely heard them. His mind was racing, piecing together the implications of this new evidence. It wasn't just that Jack had overreacted. He had fabricated the entire basis for his aggression. Logan rewound the footage, watching it again and again. Each time, the truth became clearer. Jack's frantic rush, his complete disregard for his surroundings, the forceful collision, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. "This changes everything," Logan said, his voice filled with determination. "We're not just dealing with an officer who lost his temper. We're looking at a deliberate attempt to cover up his own mistake by blaming an innocent woman." He turned to his team, his eyes blazing with renewed purpose. "Get this footage analyzed and authenticated immediately. We need to be absolutely certain it's genuine before we present it in court." As his team sprang into action, Logan sat back in his chair, a mix of emotions washing over him. Relief that they had concrete evidence to support his mother's innocence, anger at Jack's deception, and a grim satisfaction knowing that justice was now within reach. Logan drove to his mother's house, the USB drive containing the crucial video footage tucked safely in his pocket. As he pulled up to the curb, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. Lillian greeted him at the door with a warm smile, but Logan could see the worry lines etched around her eyes. "Come in, honey," she said, ushering him inside. They settled in the cozy living room, Lillian perching on her favorite armchair while Logan set up his laptop on the coffee table. "Mom, I've got something important to show you," he said, his voice gentle but serious. Lillian leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What is it, Logan?" Logan pressed play, and the security camera footage began to roll. As the scene unfolded, Lillian's eyes widened in surprise. She watched intently as Jack barreled into her on the screen, causing the coffee spill that had sparked the whole incident. When the video ended, Lillian sat back, her expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "Oh my," she breathed. "So it wasn't my fault at all." Logan nodded, reaching out to take his mother's hand. "This video proves that Jack was completely in the wrong, Mom. It shows he lied about what happened." Lillian squeezed her son's hand, but her brow furrowed with concern. "I'm glad the truth is coming out, but Logan, this case has gotten so big. It's all over the news. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with all this attention." Logan leaned in, his eyes earnest. "I know it's overwhelming, Mom, but this isn't just about what happened to you anymore. We've uncovered a pattern of abusive behavior from Jack. This case could help prevent others from suffering the same mistreatment." Lillian sighed, her gaze drifting to the family photos lining the mantel. "I understand that, honey. It's just, I've always tried to live a quiet life, to solve problems with kindness, not confrontation." "I know, Mom," Logan said softly. "And that's one of the things I admire most about you. But sometimes, standing up and speaking out is the kindest thing we can do for our community." Lillian was quiet for a moment, considering her son's words. Finally, she looked back at Logan, a mix of determination and trust in her eyes. "All right, Logan, if you believe this is the right thing to do, then I trust your judgment. We'll go forward with the case." Logan smiled, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Mom. I promise I'll be with you every step of the way." As they sat together, the weight of the decision settling between them, Lillian couldn't help but feel a flutter of anxiety in her chest. But looking at her son's confident, determined face, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The day of the first court hearing arrived, bringing with it a buzz of anticipation that filled the air. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and camera crews, all eager to catch a glimpse of the key players in this high-profile case. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Supporters of Lillian Robinson filled the rows, their faces a mix of concern and determination. The air felt thick with tension as everyone waited for the proceedings to begin. Lillian sat beside Logan at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked small and vulnerable, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. Logan placed a reassuring hand on his mother's shoulder, his face a mask of calm determination. Across the aisle, Jack Miller fidgeted nervously at the defendant's table. His once crisp uniform now seemed to hang loosely on his frame, and dark circles under his eyes hinted at sleepless nights. As the judge entered and the court was called to order, a hush fell over the room. Logan stood, his presence commanding everyone's attention. He began his opening argument, his voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Logan started, his words resonating through the courtroom. "We are here today because of a grave injustice. An injustice that goes beyond a single act of violence, but speaks to a larger pattern of abuse of power." Logan's words painted a vivid picture of the day's events, drawing the court into the scene outside the cafe. Then, with a nod to the bailiff, he said, "But rather than simply tell you what happened, I'd like to show you." A screen lowered from the ceiling and the security camera footage began to play. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the events unfolded. They saw Jack rushing into the cafe, clearly agitated. They saw him bump into Lillian, causing her to spill her coffee. And then, shockingly, they witnessed Jack's unprovoked assault on Lillian. Gasps echoed through the room. Lillian closed her eyes, reliving the painful moment. Logan's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "As you can see," Logan continued, his voice tight with controlled anger, "Officer Miller's aggression was completely unprovoked. Not only did he assault an innocent woman, but he then lied about the circumstances leading up to that assault." At the defendant's table, Jack's face had drained of color. He stared at the screen in horror, watching as his lies were exposed for all to see. His attorney leaned over, whispering urgently in his ear, but Jack seemed beyond hearing. Logan turned to face the jury, his eyes blazing with conviction. This footage proves beyond a doubt that Officer Miller abused his power, assaulted an innocent citizen, and then attempted to cover up his actions. This is not just about one incident, but about a systemic issue that allows such abuses to occur. As Logan continued his powerful opening argument, the courtroom hung on his every word. The truth of what had happened that day was now laid bare for all to see, and the impact was palpable. As the trial progressed, Logan and his legal team worked tirelessly, digging deeper into Jack's past. Their efforts paid off in ways they hadn't expected, uncovering a shocking pattern of misconduct that would change the course of the trial. On a crisp morning, Logan strode into the courtroom, his face set with grim determination. The air crackled with tension as he approached the judge's bench, a thick folder clutched in his hands. "Your Honor," Logan began, his voice steady and clear, I'd like to present new evidence that's crucial to this case." The judge nodded and Logan turned to face the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what happened to my mother was not an isolated incident. Officer Jack Miller has a long history of misconduct that has been systematically buried and ignored." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jack's face paled and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Logan opened the folder and began to read. Over the past decade, there have been no less than 7 complaints filed against Officer Miller for excessive force. 3 of these involved minority individuals who claimed racial bias in their treatment. Gasps echoed through the room. Lillian's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. "Furthermore," Logan continued, his voice growing stronger, "there are multiple reports of Officer Miller using inappropriate language and displaying aggressive behavior toward civilians during routine traffic stops." The courtroom was silent now, hanging on Logan's every word. Even the judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concern. "Most disturbing of all," Logan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room, "is a complaint filed 3 years ago by a young woman who claimed Officer Miller sexually harassed her during a late-night traffic stop. This complaint was quickly dismissed and buried." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Jack's attorney jumped to his feet, sputtering objections, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and it hung heavy in the air. Logan turned to face Jack directly, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. This man is not fit to wear a badge. He has abused his power time and time again, and the system has protected him. Today, we have a chance to put an end to this cycle of abuse. As Logan returned to his seat, the courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge called for order, his gavel echoing through the room. Jack sat frozen, the weight of his past misdeeds finally catching up with him. Lillian reached out and squeezed Logan's hand, tears glistening in her eyes. She was proud of her son, but more than that, she felt a sense of relief. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the hope for real change. As the damning evidence against Jack Miller spread like wildfire across social media platforms, the public's reaction was swift and fierce. Video clips of the cafe incident, along with details of Jack's hidden history of misconduct, flooded news feeds and timelines. People from all walks of life shared their outrage, their voices joining in a digital chorus demanding justice. Justice for the Citizens became the top trending hashtag overnight. Social media users posted and reposted the footage, each share accompanied by calls for Jack's immediate dismissal from the force. Comment sections overflowed with anger and disbelief at how such behavior had been allowed to continue unchecked for so long. Outside the police station, a crowd began to gather. What started as a handful of concerned citizens soon swelled into a sea of protesters. They held signs that read, "No more bad apples," and "Protect and serve, don't abuse." Their chants echoed through the streets, demanding accountability not just for Jack, but for the entire system that had protected him. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had once joked and laughed with Jack now averted their eyes as he passed. The usual camaraderie of the break room dissolved into awkward silence whenever he entered. Jack found himself eating lunch alone, the weight of his colleagues' judgment heavy on his shoulders. Captain Harris, once Jack's staunch defender, now kept his distance. When their paths crossed in the hallway, the captain's face was a mask of disappointment and barely contained anger. Jack could feel his world crumbling around him. As he sat at his desk staring at his computer screen, Jack's hands shook. He scrolled through news articles and social media posts, each one a fresh blow to his crumbling reputation. The fear that had been gnawing at him since the incident with Lillian now threatened to consume him entirely. Jack's thoughts raced. What if he lost his job? What about his pension? The law enforcement license he'd worked so hard to earn? Would that be stripped away too? The future he'd always taken for granted now seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. Back at the police department, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Captain Harris paced in his office, his face etched with worry. The phone on his desk hadn't stopped ringing since the video went viral. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "We need to get ahead of this," he muttered to Deputy Chief Wilson, who stood by the window, watching the growing crowd of protesters outside. Wilson turned, his expression grim. "It's not just Miller we're dealing with anymore. This whole department is under the microscope now." As if on cue, a young officer knocked on the door, her face pale. "Sir, the mayor's office is on line 1. They're demanding answers." Captain Harris sighed heavily and reached for the phone. He knew this call wouldn't be pleasant. Meanwhile, in the break room, Jack sat alone, hunched over a cold cup of coffee. The room, usually bustling with chatter and laughter, was eerily quiet. Officers who used to be his friends now gave him a wide berth, their eyes filled with a mix of disappointment and fear. Officer Martinez, once Jack's closest friend on the force, hesitated at the doorway. He looked at Jack, opened his mouth as if to say something, then shook his head and walked away. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack's phone buzzed. It was a text from his union representative. "Internal Affairs wants to meet, it doesn't look good." Jack's stomach churned as he read the message. The walls seemed to be closing in around him. As he left the break room, Jack could feel the stares of his colleagues boring into his back. Whispers followed him down the hallway. He caught snippets of conversation. Liability, disgrace, should have known better. Just then, Sergeant Peterson approached Jack, his face a mask of professionalism. "Miller, the captain wants to see you in his office. Now." Jack's heart raced as he made his way to Captain Harris's office. He could hear raised voices behind the closed door. As he reached for the handle, the door swung open, and Deputy Chief Wilson stormed out, barely acknowledging Jack's presence. Captain Harris looked up from his desk, his eyes hard. "Come in, Miller. Close the door behind you." Jack stepped inside, his legs feeling like lead. The captain's next words made his blood run cold. "The internal investigation is nearly complete, Miller. I won't sugarcoat this. They're recommending termination." The media storm hit like a hurricane. Local news stations plastered Jack's face across their broadcasts, the grainy footage of him slapping Lillian playing on repeat. Social media exploded with outrage, hashtags demanding justice trending across platforms. Jack couldn't escape it. Every time he turned on the TV or glanced at his phone, he saw his own face staring back at him, twisted with anger. The comments were brutal, calling for his badge, his job, even his freedom. At the police station, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Officers who once laughed at Jack's jokes now averted their eyes as he passed. In the locker room, conversations died as soon as he entered. Jack felt like a ghost, invisible and unwanted. Officer Martinez, once Jack's closest friend on the force, approached him hesitantly in the break room. "Jack, I don't know what to say, man. This is bad." Jack looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. But Martinez just shook his head and walked away. The rejection stung worse than any reprimand. As Jack sat at his desk trying to focus on paperwork, he overheard whispers from nearby cubicles. "Can you believe Miller's still here? He's dragging us all down with him. I heard Internal Affairs is building a case." Jack's hand shook as he tried to ignore the gossip, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was crumbling around him. Suddenly, Captain Harris's booming voice cut through the office chatter. "Miller, my office now." Jack's stomach dropped as he made his way to the captain's office. He could feel every eye in the precinct on him, judging, condemning. Captain Harris sat behind his desk, his face a storm cloud of fury. "Close the door," he growled as Jack entered. Jack complied, his heart pounding in his chest. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Captain Harris exploded, slamming his fist on the desk. "Our phones are ringing off the hook. The mayor's office is breathing down my neck. We've got protesters outside the station 24/7. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the captain cut him off. I don't want to hear it, Miller. This isn't just about you anymore. Your actions have put this entire department under scrutiny. We're all paying for your mistake." Captain Harris leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Let me be crystal clear, Miller. Your job is hanging by a thread. One more misstep, one more negative headline, and you're done. Do you understand me?" Jack nodded, unable to find his voice. "Get out of my sight," Captain Harris spat. and pray this blows over before I'm forced to make a decision I can't take back." As Jack left the office, he felt the weight of his uncertain future pressing down on him. The station, once his second home, now felt like hostile territory. He wondered how much longer he could hold on before everything he'd worked for slipped away. Jack's life outside the police station began to crumble just as quickly as his career. His phone, once constantly buzzing with messages from friends and family, now sat silent for hours on end. When he did receive a call, it was often from reporters seeking comment or angry strangers who'd somehow gotten his number. One evening, Jack sat alone in his living room, the TV muted as yet another news report about his case flashed across the screen. He picked up his phone and dialed his sister's number, desperate for some family connection. After several rings, Sheena's voice came through cold and distant. "What do you want, Jack?" "Sheena, please," Jack pleaded, his voice cracking. "I just need to talk to someone. The kids. Can I see them?" There was a long pause before Sheena replied, "I don't think that's a good idea right now, Jack. The boys have seen the news. They're confused and upset. I think it's best if you keep your distance for a while." The line went dead before Jack could respond. He stared at the phone in disbelief, the reality of his isolation sinking in. Days passed and Jack's desperation grew. He found himself sitting in his car outside Logan Robinson's law office, gathering the courage to go inside. With shaking hands, he made his way to the receptionist's desk. "I need to speak with Mr. Robinson," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's urgent." The receptionist eyed him warily. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but—" "I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. Robinson is not available without an appointment." Jack leaned in, his voice low and pleading. "Please just tell him it's Jack Miller. I'm sure he'll want to speak with me." A few tense minutes later, Logan appeared in the lobby. His face was a mask of cool professionalism as he approached Jack. "Officer Miller, I don't think it's appropriate for us to speak privately given the ongoing legal proceedings," Logan said firmly. Jack's composure cracked. "Please, Mr. Robinson, I know I messed up. I know what I did was wrong. But this case, it's destroying my life. Isn't there some way we can settle this out of court?" Logan's expression remained unchanged. "I'm sorry, but that's not possible. This case has become about more than just one incident. It's about accountability and justice for those who have suffered similar abuses of power. We can't back down now." As Logan turned to leave, Jack called out desperately, "What about your mother? Doesn't she want this to end?" Logan paused, then looked back at Jack. "My mother understands the importance of standing up against injustice, even when it's difficult. Perhaps that's something you should consider as well, Officer Miller." With that, Logan walked away, leaving Jack standing alone in the lobby, the weight of his actions pressing down on him more heavily than ever before. The day of the final court hearing arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension that hung in the air like a heavy fog. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with reporters jostling for the best view and community members filling every available seat. Lillian Robinson sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mixture of determination and unease. As Logan Robinson rose to deliver his closing argument, a hush fell over the room. His presence commanded attention, his eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Logan began, his voice clear and strong, "we are here today not just because of one incident, but because of a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long." He paced slowly in front of the jury box, his words measured and impactful. "Officer Jack Miller's assault on my mother, Lillian Robinson, was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of years of misconduct and abuse of power." Logan turned to gesture at the evidence displayed on a large screen. "You've seen the video footage. You've heard the testimonies. Officer Miller not only struck an innocent woman, but then attempted to cover up his actions by lying about the circumstances." The jury members leaned forward, their eyes fixed on Logan as he continued. "But this case goes beyond just one incident. We've presented evidence of multiple complaints against Officer Miller for excessive force and inappropriate behavior. Complaints that were buried, ignored, or dismissed." Logan's voice grew more passionate as he spoke. "This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who are meant to protect and serve are held to the highest standards. It's about making sure that no one, regardless of their position or power, is above the law. He turned to look at Jack, who sat at the defense table, his head bowed. Officer Miller's actions have not only hurt my mother, but have eroded the trust between law enforcement and the community they serve. This breach of trust affects us all. Logan then addressed the jury directly, his voice filled with conviction. I ask you today not just for justice for Lillian Robinson, but for every person who has ever felt powerless in the face of authority. I ask you to send a message that abuse of power will not be tolerated, that our community deserves better, and that change starts here, today, with your decision. As Logan concluded his argument, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lillian wiped a tear from her eye, her face a mixture of pride and sadness. Jack Miller sat motionless, the weight of Logan's words seeming to press him down in his chair. The judge called for order, his gavel echoing through the now silent courtroom. All eyes turned to the jury as they prepared to begin their deliberations, the fate of Jack Miller and the message this case would send to the community hanging in the balance. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone waited for the jury to return. After what felt like an eternity, the jurors filed back into the room, their faces unreadable. The judge called for order, and a hush fell over the crowd. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. The foreperson stood, holding a piece of paper. We have, Your Honor. All eyes were on the judge as he reviewed the verdict. Lillian reached for Logan's hand, squeezing it tightly. Jack Miller sat rigid in his chair, his face pale and drawn. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and spoke. In the case of Robinson versus Miller, on the charge of assault, the jury finds the defendant, Jack Miller, guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Lillian closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. The judge continued. Furthermore, the court finds Officer Miller guilty of abusing his power as a police officer. Jack slumped in his seat, the reality of the verdict hitting him hard. Jack Miller, the judge addressed him directly. You have betrayed the trust placed in you as a law enforcement officer. As such, your badge and law enforcement license are hereby permanently revoked. Murmurs of approval spread through the crowd. Logan squeezed his mother's hand, a small smile of vindication on his face. Additionally, the judge went on, you are sentenced to 6 months of community service. You will work directly with the community you have wronged, in hopes that you may learn from this experience and make amends for your actions. As the judge's gavel came down, finalizing the verdict, applause erupted in the courtroom. People stood, cheering and hugging one another. Lillian turned to Logan, tears in her eyes, and embraced him tightly. It's over, Mom, Logan whispered, holding her close. Justice prevailed. Across the room, Jack sat motionless, the weight of his actions and their consequences finally sinking in. He looked around at the celebrating crowd, realizing the full extent of the trust he had broken and the long road of redemption that lay ahead of him. As Lillian and Logan stepped out of the courthouse, they were met with a sea of faces. Supporters, community members, and media representatives crowded around them, their voices rising in a chorus of cheers and applause. The bright afternoon sun warmed Lillian's face and she blinked, momentarily overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Logan stood tall beside his mother, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. He scanned the crowd, his eyes shining with a mix of pride and relief. The weight of the past few months seemed to lift from his shoulders as he saw the impact their fight had made. Mrs. Robinson, how do you feel about the verdict? A reporter called out, thrusting a microphone towards Lillian. Lillian took a deep breath, her voice soft but steady as she replied, I feel at peace. It wasn't easy, but I believe justice has been served today. Logan nodded, adding, This case was about more than just one incident. It was about holding those in power accountable for their actions. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment. Lillian's gentle smile and Logan's determined expression told a story of resilience and triumph. The media was already framing the outcome as a significant victory in the fight against abuse of power. As they made their way through the crowd, well-wishers reached out to shake their hands or offer words of encouragement. Lillian felt a warmth spread through her chest, touched by the outpouring of support from her community. "You did it, Mrs. Robinson," an elderly woman called out, her eyes brimming with tears. "You stood up for all of us." Lillian paused, reaching out to clasp the woman's hand. "We all did this together," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Logan watched his mother with pride, marveling at her strength and grace even in this moment of victory. He had fought hard for justice, driven by his legal expertise and passion for civil rights. But it was his mother's quiet dignity and forgiveness that had truly touched people's hearts. As they reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, Lillian turned to Logan, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, son," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You fought for what was right, even when I was unsure." Logan hugged her back, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I learned from the best, Mom," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. In the days following the verdict, Jack Miller found himself standing in a public park, a trash picker in one hand and a garbage bag in the other. The bright orange vest he wore felt like a beacon, drawing curious and sometimes hostile glances from passers-by. This was his new reality: community service, the price he had to pay for his actions. The sun beat down on Jack's back as he stooped to pick up a discarded soda can. His face burned with shame, and anger bubbled just beneath the surface. How had it come to this? He was once a respected officer, and now he was reduced to picking up other people's trash. As he worked, Jack couldn't help but notice the people around him. Families enjoying picnics, kids playing on the swings, joggers passing by. All of them going about their lives, free from the burden he now carried. He felt their eyes on him, judging, condemning. "Hey, aren't you that cop?" a young boy called out, pointing at Jack. Jack flinched, his grip tightening on the trash picker. "Mind your own business, kid," he muttered, turning away. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift in Jack. The anger that had been his constant companion started to give way to something else: reflection. As he worked tirelessly to clean up the park, he found himself thinking about the mess he'd made of his own life. One afternoon, as Jack was emptying a trash can, he overheard a conversation between two elderly women sitting on a nearby bench. "It's nice to see the park so clean these days," one of them remarked. "Yes, and to think it's being done by that police officer who got in trouble," the other replied. "Maybe some good can come out of bad situations after all." Their words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he truly began to understand the impact of his actions, not just on himself, but on the community he had sworn to protect. As he continued his work, Jack started to see the park and its visitors in a new light. The families he once resented now became a reminder of why he had become a police officer in the first place: to serve and protect. The joggers who used to ignore him now occasionally nodded in acknowledgement, and Jack found himself nodding back. Slowly, the humiliation Jack felt began to transform into humility. He realized that this community service wasn't just a punishment. It was an opportunity to make amends, to learn, and maybe, just maybe, to become a better person. As Jack continued his community service, he found himself increasingly aware of the conversations happening around him. One sunny afternoon, while he was raking leaves in a busy area of the park, he overheard a group of college students sitting on a nearby bench. "Did you hear about that case with the police officer who slapped that innocent woman?" one of them asked. Jack's hands tightened on the rake, his knuckles turning white. He kept his head down, pretending not to listen. "Yeah, it was all over the news," another student replied. "It's crazy how some cops think they can get away with anything." "I'm just glad someone finally stood up to them," a third voice chimed in. "It's about time people in power were held accountable for their actions." Jack's face burned with shame as he heard their words. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that it wasn't like that. But he knew deep down that they were right. He had abused his power, and now he was facing the consequences. As he moved to a different area of the park, Jack encountered an elderly couple sitting on a bench. They were engrossed in conversation, unaware of his presence nearby. "It's a shame what happened to that poor woman," the old lady said, shaking her head. "To think she was just going about her day when that officer attacked her." Her husband nodded solemnly. "It makes you wonder how many other people have suffered silently. At least this time justice was served." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He had never stopped to consider how his actions might have affected others beyond Lillian Robinson. How many people had he intimidated or scared over the years? How many lives had he impacted negatively? Later that day, as Jack was emptying trash cans, he overheard a group of mothers talking while their children played on the swings. "I used to feel safe when I saw a police officer," one of them said. "Now I'm not so sure anymore." "I know what you mean," another replied. "It's scary to think that the people who are supposed to protect us might be the ones we need protection from." Their words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He had never considered himself a threat to the community he had sworn to serve and protect. But now, hearing the fear and distrust in their voices, he realized the full extent of the damage he had done. As the day wore on, Jack found himself unable to shake off the weight of guilt that settled on his shoulders. Every conversation he overheard, every fearful glance thrown his way, reminded him of the pain and anger his actions had caused. By the time his shift ended, Jack felt emotionally drained. As he walked home, the realization hit him hard. His life would never be the same again. The respect and authority he once commanded were gone, replaced by suspicion and resentment. He had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything wrong with the system he had once been proud to be a part of. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Jack's tired muscles ached from a day of hard work. He leaned on his rake, wiping sweat from his brow, when a familiar voice caught his attention. His heart skipped a beat as he turned to see Logan and Lillian Robinson walking along the path, deep in conversation. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. They hadn't noticed him yet, and he found himself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Lillian's gentle laugh carried on the breeze, reminding Jack of the warmth and kindness he had so carelessly destroyed that fateful day outside the cafe. Logan walked beside his mother, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Even from a distance, Jack could see the deep bond between them, the love and respect that radiated from their every interaction. It was a stark contrast to the fear and distrust he now saw in people's eyes when they looked at him. As Logan and Lillian strolled past a colorful flower bed, Lillian paused to admire the blooms. Jack watched as Logan patiently waited, a soft smile on his face. It was a simple moment, but it spoke volumes about the kind of people they were, the kind of person Jack had once aspired to be. The weight of his actions crashed down on Jack like a tidal wave. Here were the two people whose lives he had turned upside down, going about their day with grace and dignity. And here he was, reduced to picking up trash in the very community he had sworn to protect. Unable to bear the sight any longer, Jack shuffled over to a nearby bench and sank down heavily. He buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the stark reality of his situation. The life he had known, the respect, the authority, the sense of purpose, was gone, shattered by his own hand in a moment of uncontrolled anger. As he sat there, the sounds of the park faded away. All Jack could hear was the echo of his own harsh words that day, the sharp crack of his hand against Lillian's cheek. He had replayed that moment countless times in his mind, wishing desperately that he could take it back. But there was no going back. His actions had set off a chain of events that had stripped him of everything he held dear. His job, his reputation, his future, all gone in the blink of an eye. And for what? A spilled cup of coffee and a bruised ego. As Jack sat on the bench, his eyes followed Logan and Lillian until they disappeared from view. The park around him bustled with life, children laughing, dogs barking, and families enjoying the warm evening. But Jack felt isolated, cut off from the world he once knew. For the first time since his downfall, Jack allowed himself to truly reflect on the choices that had led him to this point. He thought about the day at the cafe, replaying the moment when his anger had taken control. He saw Lillian's shocked face, heard the gasps of the onlookers, and felt the weight of his actions crashing down on him. Jack's mind wandered to the other incidents throughout his career. The times he'd used excessive force, the complaints he'd dismissed, the people he'd hurt. He'd always justified his actions, believing he was above reproach. But now, stripped of his badge and uniform, he could no longer hide behind that shield. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, Jack felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Remorse. It was a strange, uncomfortable feeling that settled in his chest like a heavy stone. He thought about Lillian's kind face and gentle nature, and how he had repaid her kindness with cruelty. For the first time, Jack considered that perhaps he had been wrong. Not just about that day at the cafe, but about so many things. His prejudices, his quick temper, his belief that his badge gave him the right to act without consequences. All of it had led him to this moment. As he watched a young family walk by, their faces bright with laughter, Jack felt a pang of longing. He realized how much he had lost. Not just his job and reputation, but the respect of his community, the trust of his colleagues, and the love of his family. In that moment, sitting alone on a park bench, Jack began to wonder if change was possible. Could he become a better person? Could he learn to control his anger and confront his prejudices? The path ahead seemed daunting, but for the first time Jack felt a glimmer of hope. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Years of ingrained behavior and beliefs couldn't be undone overnight. But as he watched the sun setting over the park, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jack made a silent promise to himself. He would try. He would take responsibility for his actions and work to become the kind of person who truly served and protected his community. As the days passed, Jack continued his community service in the park. Each morning he'd arrive early, armed with a trash picker and a large plastic bag. The work was monotonous, but it gave him plenty of time to think. One sunny afternoon, Jack found himself near the playground. The air was filled with the joyful shrieks of children as they ran, climbed, and swung. He paused for a moment, leaning on his trash picker, and watched the scene before him. A little girl with pigtails tumbled off the slide, scraping her knee. Jack instinctively took a step forward, but then hesitated. He was no longer Officer Miller, the man people turned to for help. Now, he was just Jack, the man in the bright orange vest picking up litter. As he stood there, uncertain, a young mother rushed over to comfort the crying child. She scooped up the little girl, wiped her tears, and kissed the scrape. Within moments, the child was giggling again, ready to tackle the slide once more. Jack felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the tender interaction. He thought about all the times he could have shown that kind of gentleness in his work, but chose aggression instead. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him heavier than ever. A group of older kids ran past, laughing and shouting. One of them, a boy with a mop of curly hair, stumbled and fell. His friends immediately stopped, helping him up and checking if he was okay. Their care for each other was evident, even in this small moment. As Jack observed these acts of kindness and compassion, he felt a stirring in his heart. He realized that true strength wasn't about wielding power or instilling fear. It was about lifting others up, about being there for your community in times of need. The path to redemption suddenly seemed clearer to Jack. It wasn't just about serving his time or following the rules. It was about fundamentally changing who he was as a person. He needed to learn empathy, to cultivate kindness, to become the type of person who truly protected and served. Jack knew it wouldn't be easy. Years of ingrained behavior and prejudice couldn't be erased overnight. But as he watched the children play, their laughter echoing across the park, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could become a better person. Not for the sake of regaining his old life, but for the sake of becoming someone worthy of being part of this community. With a deep breath, Jack picked up his trash bag and moved on to the next area of the park. The journey ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. True redemption, he realized, could only come through personal transformation. If you enjoyed the story of Lillian, Logan, and Jack, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.